So yesterday, really, we set out the day at the beginning, I suppose, trying to think about three things, which is firstly to give you an overview of the what, and you'll remember we went through the priority projects. Secondly, then we really wanted to spend the majority of the day thinking about brand purpose and the why. So if you can think back through the haze of a 2:30 finish, you'll remember we talked about a kind of local good cause. We had Liz from UK Sport talking about how lottery funding had made an impact there. And then we also had our winners talking about, I suppose, life-changing and what it means for them and the transformation it meant for their life. And then we started to get into the conversation about the how. And you'll remember reenacting Trafalgar Square and various other bits and pieces that were happening yesterday afternoon. And you remember that we got 99 out of 100, and a sterling performance from everyone. So well done for that. Today is really, I suppose, much more about the how. So to start the morning off, we have Paul here is going to lead a session on capability for performance, and so you'll hear more about that in a minute. Then we're going to run a session, as we teed up yesterday, about simplification, and just to come back to that theme that came out from the engagement survey, cross-functional working. What are the big opportunities that really span more than one area where we can really start to look at how we can do things differently to try and remove some of that grit in the system? And then finally to come on, and the last session will be about ourselves a bit more, again thinking about development, thinking about PDPs and Mega Fridays. The walk of shame. Sorry, that was mean. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Sorry, right. Where was I? I've completely blown my own agenda. Where are we? Oh, thank you. Yeah, then we're going to thank you close. Before I do that, in keeping with yesterday, who has done that kind of default behaviour where you just go and sit back at the same chair where you were yesterday with the same people? If you're with the same people you were with yesterday, can I ask you to get up and move around and find some people you didn't spend some time with yesterday in that interest of getting to know each other better, and find somebody new to sit with? I can see this is met with an overwhelming sense of enthusiasm.
But obviously, Nick and Daniel just sort of talked a little bit about what we did yesterday. And again, just sort of framing it around the, why we're here as Camelot and the kind of purpose. We had some really good sessions yesterday. When we talk about the what we need to do, we do tend to focus quite a lot on the big priority projects. But obviously, there's an awful lot more we do as Camelot, and all of you have day jobs, some of which are related to those big priority projects, but a lot of it is more business as usual stuff, just to kind of keep everyday operations running and everything going on. But actually, everyone in this room, I think, is really clear on the kind of what they need to be doing. And some of the alignment, actually, around being really clear on targets and objectives and activities, for me, is really, really important. So that's kind of really clear. The how, as was just said, is when we're going to focus a lot more on that today. And just to clarify what I said yesterday on the bonus front, just so everyone's really, really clear, the intention that everybody has to have a PDP linked to the bonus is for all staff. The intention to weight the bonus by performance will apply to everyone, including grade 2s, but not at this stage grade 1s. And we're going to spend a bit of time over the next year thinking about whether we roll it out right through to our grade 1s as well. But one of the things that needs to be in place is appropriate leadership and management from some of the grade 2 teams that are managing some of those teams. And we're not confident yet we've got the sort of management maturity and capability might need to help that group sort of prepare for that and differentiate appropriately. So it'll apply to everybody in terms of the PDP link, but the performance rating point will apply to grade 2s and above, but not grade 1s at this stage, and we'll think about that going forward. And the bit I said to you yesterday, I would just like to remind you of, which is most important perspective to have during this whole session, yesterday today, is what does it mean for you personally? Don't hide behind what does it mean for Camelot, what does it mean for your team, what does it mean for your function. Actually, really confront head on what does it mean for you personally. And one thing I just wanted to spend a couple of moments talking a bit about this morning, actually, is responsibility. And where's Alison? Is Alison here somewhere? There we are. There's Alison at the back. Alison is our head of corporate social responsibility, but we've moved that from being a bit of an adjunct in the business where it was a bit disconnected, to actually putting it in the heart of the strategy and innovation team, so reporting into it through Matt and Sally, very deliberately, because when you think about responsibility for a business like ours, it's actually not necessarily the same as it is for some other businesses. So we had somebody who came in and spoke to us a year or so ago from Marks and Spencer, and quite impressive guy, talking all about the kind of responsibility agenda in Marks and Spencer. But the real sense you got was they committed lots of sins, in terms of environment and energy and all sorts of things. And then for them, social responsibility was trying to kind of make up for that a bit and try and do some stuff to sort of offset some of the bad things they're causing. I mean, that's oversimplification, but that was broadly it. And for a lot of companies, it is a bit that. They kind of get on with their main thing, and then they have a little bit of CSR on the side, and they take it more or less seriously. And they need to be seen to be taken seriously. So some of them are quite good at giving the impression they take it very seriously, but at the end of the day, it still isn't taken that seriously. My old employer, Unilever, I would say has gone from sort of talking quite a good game to actually genuinely being at the heart of their business. And Unilever's whole global strategy now is built on sustainability, and they have a really good responsibility strategy at the heart of their business. And we talked about this a lot in our strategy process last summer, and we decided that actually we're only 800 people, we've only got a few offices, we don't create a huge amount of energy consumption, we don't actually have a terrible carbon footprint, etc., etc. But the most important issues for us in terms of responsibility are we running the national lottery in a responsible way? Are we being responsible stewards in the kind of national treasure that we are stewarding during this period of time, and hopefully for many more decades to come? And when we really strip that down, there's really two things. One is the way in which we design the games, and the other is actually where we need to, putting appropriate player limits and player protection in place. And that's where, for us, and for me personally, I would say, the clear blue water between what we do in the lottery world and the rest of the gambling sector, I think, is incredibly important. Now, some of you worked in gambling, and that's kind of fine, and some of you are very comfortable. I personally am very happy to go and spend a night at the casino, or whatever it might happen to be. But I would never want to run what I would call a pure gambling company. Because the gambling model is very different. The gambling model is basically the 10-15% of people who like to gamble, find the 1% VIPs, find the super VIPs, and mine every last penny you can out of them, actually. It's sort of the model. And actually, if you look at William Hill on their website, the daily limits are 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, whatever you want to spend as a Premier League footballer. But actually, in our case, you have some much more straightforward limits, £350 a week, 80 plays a day, and we're thinking hard about, as more and more of the sales are happening in the digital world, how do we put the appropriate player limits in place? There are very, very, very few people that we can find who have a problem with the lottery, and most of, to the extent there are any, they tend to have a problem with gambling and happen to also play the lottery. I don't think people get addicted to the lottery, and some of the gambling problems that happen in the UK are essentially to do with the gambling sector, not the lottery sector. But nonetheless, there's a big debate about player protection and social responsibility. And for the Gambling Commission, we now have a shared regulator. Their number one priority is social responsibility and player protection. So we're thinking hard about those issues, but we think we have very good frameworks in place, and particularly in a digital world, actually, we can offer the right tools. But what we find is the vast majority of our players don't see themselves as gamblers, don't have any issues with it. And actually, if you start talking that sort of language to them, they find it quite disturbing, because all they're doing is playing the lottery and having a dream and trying to win. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is game design, which is about the way in which we design the games, actually making sure they're kind of enjoyable, things like actually playing the whole game rather than being able to jump straight to the result, and actually thinking about the game design and the game tools. And we're looking to pioneer some new game design and game tools going forward. And there's some quite interesting thinking that Alison and the research team and some of the other teams are doing at the moment. But I was just struck by the values discussion we had yesterday, and we didn't talk about responsibility, actually, which or maybe it's kind of covered by decent, I'm not quite sure, but it's just one to bear in mind, actually, that I think one of our most important strengths is over the last 20-odd years, I think we have run the National Lottery in a very responsible way, and the fact we have 70% of the population playing and everyone playing a bit is a really important part of our model. And there are some other countries around the world where it's about many fewer players playing a lot more. And somewhere like Massachusetts, which is a heavy-duty scratch card state, because other gambling isn't actually allowed, you've got many more people are probably really genuinely addicted to buying scratch cards and actually over kind of consuming them. So that model of how we keep that balance, because for me, success for us going forward is going to be about 70% of the British population, ideally more, playing the National Lottery, being something everyone can join in together, and us making sure we're getting that balance right as we try to grow. We try to grow in a way that includes loads of people still, which brings us back to a need to innovate and be creative. So And I thought it's just worth making a few comments on that, and to say that part of the vision going forward is we make that even more central, and it's something that everyone in every team in the business should be thinking about as part of the agenda. What does being responsible mean for me, for my job, my area? And don't just assume that what we've done up to now is sufficient. We need to keep working, new threats coming along, new opportunities coming along. And I would say that the world generally is raising the bar on their expectations of companies, and we have to sort of raise our game in line with that as well. So for me, that's really important. The other thing I wanted to just briefly talk about was creativity and innovation. And it was really super impressive, actually, the team building exercise yesterday. And talking to the guy again at the very end, he genuinely said it was exceptional. And he said three things in particular. One was the speed with which everyone got going was actually really good, whereas most groups spend about half the time dithering. Normally, there's about 20% of people who slope off and hide behind the bike sheds. Now, those of you who did it well, because he didn't notice. So he had the impression, although the group that never caught the cat, we weren't quite sure where you were, actually. But then the other thing was, there were some natural leaders and organisers, and some of Camelot's project management skills came into play. And actually, went with the kind of DNA of some of the strengths of the company. But what I thought was interesting was in 80 minutes, this group of people went out and did all that in a quite freewheeling way. And we didn't have lots of project process meetings, and we didn't have to go and check with our boss whether we could go and do this, that, the other. People just got on with stuff. And the key was clarity about the task, clarity about the objective, clarity about where we were heading. Everyone was aligned. Everyone was pointing in the same direction. And then people just kind of got on with it, used their common sense, used their ingenuity, used their creativity. And for me, that would be a really good blueprint. Yes, it was an artificial exercise, but a really good blueprint about where I'd like Camelot to get more to. That we're crystal clear why we're here. We're crystal clear what we're trying to do. We're crystal clear what the business stuff we need to deliver. We all know what our roles are. And actually, we're able to just kind of get on with stuff and make it all happen. And of course, you need some process. And of course, you need some checks and balances. And of course, you need some, informed courage rather than reckless courage. And we've got to make sure certain things work really, really well. And we've got to manage risk in a balanced way, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of it, it's about people just being intelligent, getting on with stuff. And a lot of it is about people working cross teams, cross departments, not sitting in their silos, not waiting to be told to get permission for something. And actually ask forgiveness, not permission, and push the boundaries a bit more. And actually, if you can create a context for your teams where they can just get on with stuff more. We have got very talented people. You are a very bright, intelligent, talented group of people in this room. You've got great teams that work for you. We've got some really good people at Camelot. And I don't think we have done as good a job as we can do in unlocking the potential of everybody. And we got a bit of a glimpse yesterday of what people can do if they kind of set free a bit. And that seems to me just the direction we need to push into, is how do we unlock some of that creativity, innovation, ingenuity on top of all the other good stuff we have. And that's where today's agenda is really important, because we're going to hear from a minute around capability and performance from Paul. The simplification thing is really important. How can we strip out some of the baggage that just gets in the way? And then the final session is very much back to you, personal development. How can you grow, develop, particularly as leaders, particularly in terms of how you manage your teams. And that's really what I want to say. So I want to introduce Paul. Paul is a regular speaker at conferences and events. He's also an author. I think he's written 2 books, but very much focusing on performance and capability. As I understand it, Paul used to be a board director on a multinational IT company, now runs his own business, basically helping companies and individuals in terms of coaching and development. I think we noticed from your LinkedIn site a couple of interesting things. I'm not sure you're going to tell us any more about this, but Paul, you'll be very impressed to know, won a sack race when he was age 10. So he knows about performance and capability, this man. And he was also, apparently, something happened with the police in London. I'm not sure we're going to tell anything about this story, but we'll find out. But he is going to tell us and talk to us about performance and capability. And I'd like you to join me in giving him a very warm welcome. So a warm welcome to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we had a few. Here's some samples of those onesies. It's just sheer coincidence this happened to be about super managers. This is very much about the how. So I think you've been talking about how. So we're going to be looking at how, but more specifically how you can, as a manager, do better. I think that came out from what Andy was just talking about as well. Now, I know not all of you in the room are managers, but you wouldn't be here without a level of responsibility in the organisation. So I will talk to you as though you are all managers. Is that fair? Okay. So this is, at a high level, what we've got to look at. So this is my promise to you. We'll get through these different things. I won't read those words because you can do that. I'm assuming you can read. The promise at the bottom is the most important one. We're going to have a few pictures, not too many slides, and a few stories, and I might talk about the police one. We'll see. You've talked about your own superpowers, your own superheroes within the organisation. Some of you stood up before, so you're already kind of anointed in the club. Actually, a lot of you are already superheroes. You just don't know it yet. So that's part of what I'm here to do, is explain why you have those superhero powers and capabilities and how you can use them effectively. But just out of sheer interest, if you did have a superpower, you know, one of those special ones like invisibility or teleportation or something, or mind reading, what would you want? You. What would you want? If you had a superpower at all, what would it be? So just take a couple of minutes and think, if I had one superpower, just allowed one, what would it be, and what would I do with it? So have a chat to your neighbours about that, any superpower you want, and then we'll get a few examples from the room, because it's kind of fun to find out what people would like to do with them. How are we doing here? What sort of ideas have you got? People are obviously very invested in this idea of having a superpower. You guys are getting really carried away here. That took a bit of stopping. That was like a train on a track, that one. So let's have a couple of examples. What superpower would you want to have, and why would you want to have it? Go for it.
I'd like to reverse time so you can kind of go back and fix all the things you didn't get right the first time, basically. So just give you that hindsight, basically, ability, and then hit it right.
You're saying he wants to reverse time so he can go back and fix the things that didn't quite work right first time around. There was a Tom Cruise movie out recently, wasn't it? Live, Die, Repeat, or something that had that kind of idea where you could keep going back and doing it again and again and again until you got it right. Any other ones? Yeah. Healing. Well, all the way from dead back to life, not just healing. So this is more than just sick people. This is, yeah? That'd be a cool one to have. What other ones have you got? Anybody else? You were talking a lot.
Been able to clone myself so that I've been two places at the same time.
Being able to clone yourself so you can be two places in the same... why?
Don't take this the wrong way.
Okay, no, I won't. But they might.
But you know, if you may have had a couple of drinks the night before, you're feeling a little bit
Okay.
the worse for it. You could be in a conference.
Yeah. And still in, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. That's a new one. I haven't come across that one before. What other ones have we got? The old standards haven't come up. I'm sorry? Fly. Yeah, how would you use that? All right. Yeah. What, just by the scruff of the neck, or is it just kind of... Yeah, reading minds is a scary one, isn't it? Because you've got to be able to turn it off or selective. That would be... I mean, imagine being in this room right now and just having everybody's thoughts pounding on you. That would be kind of tough. What about invisibilities? A few people normally say that because they love to get up all sorts of mischief.
I was told I wasn't allowed to say that.
All right. The other one that somebody said the other day when I did this talk was like the X-Men, you know, that Mystique, the blue lady who can change her physical appearance to be anybody. And the lady who said that said, God, I could get up to the mischief for that one. So that was her desire. Okay, that was a bit of fun. Let's just back off a minute and look at management. What is management? If you were going to give me just a fairly normal, bog standard definition of management, what would you say? Come on, let's have a...
Creating the right environment for your team to succeed.
Creating the right environment. That's a pretty good one. That's actually, strangely enough, not often the bog standard one that people would come up with. That's a more advanced one. So we're getting onto some of that today. You've been reading my slides, haven't you? What would be the more... it's all right, don't get embarrassed. See, he's already showing his superpowers. This is pre-science or something, yeah? What else would you say? And this is the normal way that people would say what a manager is or what a manager does. Managing people, okay. And so it's about, to do what? I mean, for what purpose? Getting things done through others. That's normally where people end up with, as I said, the bog standard definition of management. Getting things done through others, which obviously manages the environment, manages people. Yeah?
The first time I was manager, I didn't know what to do, so I had to do some research. And I learned something that stuck with me. And basically, the job of manager is make sure that the team succeeds. If the team succeeds, then you are succeeding as a manager. That's the way you are measured.
Absolutely, yeah. So you've been reading my slides too. So it's about making sure that the team succeeds, because if the team succeeds, as a manager, you succeed. So effectively, it comes back to the managing or getting things done through other people. Now, in terms of getting things done, if other people are going to do it, you're going to be managing their performance. So it comes back to performance. At some level, you kind of got to come back to that. Okay? So that's what we're talking about, is how to look at that performance, how to manage that performance, a slightly new way to look at it. So that's kind of where we're going with management, at least today. That's not a self-portrait, by the way. I wouldn't be caught there with a VPL that obvious. So, you know. If you're not quite sure what that is, turn to a woman next to you somewhere. So this is a story about a mechanic, as you might imagine. There's the mechanic. Just imagine for a moment that you are driving an 8-year-old boy to football practice. Maybe your son, maybe your neighbour's son, a nephew, somebody, 8-year-old boy, little Johnny, he's in the back seat behind you there. You're driving him to football practice. You drive out of your driveway and realise there's a little strange noise under the bonnet of your car. And you're a bit worried about that because you haven't heard that before. So on the way to football, just around the corner from your house, is the garage where you always take your car. And there's a mechanic there who you trust, and he's very good, And you go to the mechanic and you say, there's a noise under my bonnet of my car. I'm not sure if it's going to cause any problems or not. Can you please have a listen? So there he is having a listen to the noise under the bonnet in your car. And he says, it's okay, it happens on this model sometimes. It's a known fault, it's just a little plastic part. It's about that big, actually. There's a crack through the middle. And what's happening is that's rattling, and that's what you can hear, is that part's rattling. And he says, it's okay, it's not a problem. We got some in the spares, I'll grab one, I'll replace it, and you'll be on your way in a couple of minutes, it'll cost you £20. That's a cheap garage visit, by the way, in case you hadn't realised. So the mechanic goes off, you say to Little, it's okay, we will get to football practice. We got some time in hand. We did our risk management on traffic, so we're okay. The mechanic comes back a couple of minutes later and he says, I'm really, really sorry. But the computer says no. We don't have that spare part in stock. We can get one in first thing tomorrow morning, so I will come to your house just round the corner. I will fix the car on your driveway completely for free, no charge at all. Because we should have had that part. You're a regular customer. And however, there's one little extra piece, is if you keep driving it, the rest of that part could break off. And if that happens, you could do some serious damage. So take your car straight home right now, park it up, and I'll come fix it for you first thing in the morning. You are now driving back round the corner to your house. Little Johnny's looking a bit grumpy in the back seat. My question to you is, was that mechanic capable of fixing your car? Yes or no? First reaction, show of hands. Anybody for yes? Anybody for no? Kind of mixed. Few more for yes than no. It's an interesting question, isn't it? What if I was to say, Johnny, if he stops crying, was that mechanic capable of fixing our car? What would little Johnny say? No. That's interesting, isn't it? How come for those of you who said yes, Johnny actually has a different answer? And yet you're both driving the same broken car back round the corner to the same house. Different perspectives, different meaning. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on. I'll tell you, I've asked this now of thousands and thousands of people at different conferences, had shows of hands. I often speak at learning and development conferences, and there the answer is normally yes. A very strong proportion of the audience will say yes. When I'm speaking to a more business-oriented audience, the answer is often much more oriented towards no. People are seeing this word capability differently. What I think is actually going on in the heads of people who answered yes is they're actually answering the question, was he competent? Not was he capable. Capability and competence, to me, are two different things. The mechanic was competent, but in the moment when he was asked to do the job in front of him, he was not capable of doing it. Now, as a customer, as little Johnny, I don't really give a toss why he couldn't do it. I just know that I'm driving home and not going to football practice. So capability and competence are two different things. Now, and what I'm not trying to do is redefine your dictionary or anything about what those words are. You use them the way you want to use them. What I'm trying to point out is that other people will be using them differently. So of the room, half and half, you're using it differently, that word, because of the way you answered that question. So if you're having conversations internally about competence and capability and those kind of concepts, be aware that there's some differences in the way that people think about those terms. So you need to define them. You need to get clear about what you're talking about. I was in a boardroom once, big company, and they were talking about capability. The word was being used, and eventually I had to say, listen, hey, time out, guys, time out. There's an elephant in the room. Nobody even knows it's there, let alone ignoring it. And I gave them that story about the mechanic, and they went, oh, shit. Then they started getting real about what was really going on. So that's kind of what we're doing, is drilling into that concept of capability in this little session to get real about what's actually happening, what's going on, and how that impacts and affects performance. So capability is, can the person do the job in front of them? To me, so let's use that definition for this session. You can choose to use something different later, but just for now, let's focus on the fact that when someone is capable, they can do the task that's placed in front of them when they're asked to do it. If they cannot do it, for whatever reason, like a missing spare part, in that moment they are incapable of serving the customer, regardless whether that customer is internal or external. So if you think about that, you're starting to notice that actually there's an impact. Oh, by the way, here's a picture on, this is what happens if you're incapable. I've had that expression on my face 1 or 2 times, but this is actually a New Zealand cartoonist, so this is where I get in the bit that this accent's from New Zealand, it's not from the West Island. And there's some more stuff about New Zealand later on. I've got to feed that in there somewhere, you know. So just for a minute at your table, just a couple of minutes, talk about that difference between capability and competence. Do you agree with what I've just said? Does that make sense? Is there something completely different, do you think? So just have a chat for a couple of minutes about the difference between capability and competence. Are they different?
I was a no, but I was a yes before I listened to Paul speak, because I always deem capability as that I can do it.
Yeah. No, I do have that thinking that, you know, if you go somewhere and someone can do something
I think the interesting bit for me is that we don't always try and find the root cause of why somebody is capable or not capable. We'll always say, well, they can't be bothered, or we go to the attitude. But we don't necessarily look for other areas. So people kind of talked about environment or having to do the job or having a manager. But a default always seems to be that they're underperforming and they can't be bothered to do it, or they haven't got the intelligence to do it. So, yeah, I think it's about it.
Okay. How did you get on? Did you have any more thoughts on that capability versus competence? Do they seem different to you now, or they still seem the same, or they seem opposite to the way I define them? What do you think? A little bit blurry. They're slippery concepts, aren't they? Absolutely. They are very slippery. And that's really what's underneath what I'm trying to say, is they are slippery, so be aware. It's kind of like beware, there's ice here. Because a lot of people just go ahead in the workplace using words thinking everybody else understands what they mean. So you'll be careful about some of these things. Any other sort of comments other than blurry, slippery?
I think we were pretty clear with Martin describing capable and incompetent.
Sorry, what was that again there?
We'd rather be incapable, which is sort of time-bound, resource-bound.
Yeah.
Incompetent, which is definitely
You'd rather be incapable than incompetent. Yeah, give it that. Okay. Well, if you're incompetent, there's room to grow. Is that interesting?
I think you thought about how our players, if they want to do something that they should be able to do, and they can't do it, they don't care whether it's out of competence or whether they're able to sort of
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And he was saying that actually the players don't necessarily care if they can't play. They don't really care whether it's an individual that's incompetent or the organisation that somehow has failed them or whatever. It's like little Johnny in the back seat. That's why he's there in the story. He actually is a much more valid end customer of that mechanic service than the person, you, who were driving the car. And that's why there was a difference. So we're getting a little feedback on the system here. So this is why we're looking at the slide earlier. The word environment turns up. Just unpack this slide slightly. This is on a handout you're going to get later, by the way, so there's no need to make notes on it. If we're looking at performance at the very top, in order for performance to happen, people need to be capable in the moment of doing what they're asked to do. That seems reasonable. So whenever you're talking about performance, you're talking about capability in the way that I've defined it here. In other words, can the job in front of someone be done by that person? Can they adequately respond to that job to get the job done? So that's what, so if we back off performance. So what we're doing here is we're unpicking performance because it's a big concept. And it's very difficult to say, well, actually, if we've got this performance improvement we need, where do we tackle it? Where are the levers to pull? So this is how to start drilling down to find out where those levers are. Because often when we start looking at performance, it's this big amorphous thing, and it's kind of hard to get our hands around it. Again, it's a slippery concept. It's fuzzy. How do we change it? How do we manage it? So this is about unpacking it in a way. So if we're talking about capability, now, because of the story, you can now see there's two different sides to the equation or to the system that's running in order to create capability. One is about the performer themselves, so the competence of the performer, and the other is about the environment within which they're operating or performing. If you've got a performer, what stage are they performing on? And so that's all the stuff on the right-hand side. We're going to go and unpack this a lot more, different bits and pieces, and explain how to use this. And the reason that little chef is down there is because it's a recipe. And the neat thing about recipes is if you know what the recipe is, you can fix bits of it. If your cake didn't turn out well, then you can change it. And that's one of the important things about a recipe. Whoops. We're going to go back. So what we'll do is have a look at some of these things on the left. And in order for capability to happen, we need a person that's competent with the different things that make up competence for the individual. And we need an environment that's competent in order to support that person when they're in place doing the job in front of them. Until you get both of those things in place, you are not going to get people being capable of doing what's in front of them, and therefore you will not get the performance that you're wanting. So you see, we're drilling back into this. So this is how to look at performance in a slightly new way. Because unfortunately, most performance management that's out there in terms of management training courses and books and stuff tends to focus on measurement. So we'll measure stuff. And when we've measured it, we can decide if people are doing what we want them to do. We can decide if they're performing up to scratch. And if they're not, then we'll focus on that person. And then we'll decide whether we need to send them for some training, beat them with a bigger stick, or free up their future. Or perhaps they just need more motivation. You know, we'll have a motivation or an engagement session or something. But of course, that approach to performance is fundamentally flawed because it's only looking at the left-hand side of this system that's running. And too often we ignore the stuff on the right. And we'll come on to how to handle that and why that's important in a minute. So, had to fit a Kiwi in there somewhere, got to do that. What I'm going to do is tell you a couple of stories about the things on their left-hand side, about the competence part of this equation, just to give you a sense of what they are. The first one on the left was knowledge. Knowledge is information that we have internally that we can recall and retrieve on demand when required. Stuff we've got memorized. I'll tell you that story since I've got a couple with this. But I first got into the UK in 1984. A couple of weeks after I'd been here, I hired a car. I was driving in London. It was night. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. It was dark. And suddenly there were all these blue flashing lights around me. It's all right, the story ends well. So I stopped and I rolled down the window, and these lovely people in uniforms came up and they said, "Do you realise?" Actually, it's nice, when I got here, I was quite pleased they weren't wearing guns. Now, they don't in New Zealand either, but other countries I've been in, they wore guns. That's a bit more scary. And they said, "Do you realise you're driving down a one-way street the wrong way?" And I went, no, in my best New Zealand accent. It was a bit stronger back then. Probably why I got away with it, by the way. So no, there's no ticket at the end of it. I did walk. And they said, "There's some signs that you passed, some no entry signs." And I said, "Really? I didn't see those." They said, "Yeah, they're there, those round ones. You can still see them at the end of the street. You know the ones I mean? They're round, they're red, and they got that white thing through the middle. We don't have those in New Zealand. We have no entry signs, but they've got no entry written on them because we can read in New Zealand." So I'd blithely gone past these signs because I didn't know what they were. You've got to be able to know what the road signs are in order to drive safely. You can't have the road code out. So knowing what the road signs are is knowledge you must have internalized in order to drive. Now, knowing what the tyre pressures need to be in the tyres is not critical to drive. You can outsource that knowledge to a handbook or a manual or someplace else. So that can be environmental knowledge. So I'm not talking about that. Now, I may know what the tyre pressures are, but I don't need to. There is stuff I need to know in order to drive. I may know more, but there's a threshold of knowledge I need to have. That's what I mean by knowledge. Okay. I used to work in a really posh hotel, and it was the one where the Queen would stay when she was visiting. And I worked in the restaurant when I was a student. And yes, I used to mix cocktails. No, I did not wear red braces. I wish I had now in hindsight. But and we didn't mix them with these fancy cold, dry ice and other bits like that. But we did have to mix cocktails. There's quite a skill in doing that. The second thing on that list on the left was skill. These are things that you need to have that you can do, that you've practiced. One of the skills we had to have in that hotel was silver service. You know, the spoon and the fork trick. And when it was royalty there, or we had some posh guests, we had to wear white gloves as well. Now, white gloves, cotton gloves, spoon and fork, trying to handle rather slippery vegetables and all the rest, that was quite tricky. You had to practice that. A few of you have done that silver service stuff? Sure, I mean, a lot of us have. You know, it's a student job. One of the things that we did to practice, we had this lovely Yugoslavian maitre d' who was very, very good, and he taught us this, was in order to practice is use tea bags. They're about the same slipperiness as a roast potato. So using them, so that was practice. So we had to practice for hours using tea bags, stacking them up, folding them over, doing all this with the spoon and fork. So when we came to the tables, we could do it, not a problem. That's what I mean by a skill that you can practice. There's lots of other skills as well, right through to communication skills. They require a bit of practice. And even things like walking, talking, typing, these are skills that people bring to the job. So that's what I mean by skill. The third one down the list was mindset or attitude. Now, some of you may feel like that today, depending on what time you don't remember going to bed last night. In the moment and when you're at a job, there is a thing, we sometimes term it motivation, how we feel about doing what we want to do. Are we up for it? Now this, by the way, is different to engagement. There's a lot of talk about engagement. Engagement's a sort of a more underlying, slower changing thing, whereas your day-to-day motivation can cycle quite rapidly depending on an email you just got or a phone call you just got. You might be really up because it's great news or down because it's bad news. That doesn't necessarily change your engagement with the organization. Now, over time, if you get lots of bad news, it will. Over time, if you've got lots of good news and you're motivated a lot more, your engagement will lift. But it's an underlying, more steady current. See, this guy might be still really engaged with that company. He wants to work with them, but just today he's got a hangover. So right now he doesn't want to know. But as an engaged employee, he could still be very engaged. See the difference? So what we're talking about here in the moment is the motivation or mindset or attitude that is in place in order to do this thing that's in front of me that I'm being asked to do. So it's very much at the point of work we're talking about. Because that's when it matters, not before or after. It's actually when the job needs to be done. The fourth thing down that list is not that common in many jobs, and it was physiology. The reason that's up there is I used to work in an ice cream factory when I was a student. And my job, amongst others there, was to drive fork trucks in the freezers. Now that's a real sporting job, driving fork trucks on slick ice floors. But on the fleet of fork trucks, 2 of them had quite low safety cages. And I'm kind of tall, so I couldn't fit into a couple of them. Not with the hard hat and all the 3 layers of balaclavas and everything else. It was minus 18 degrees in there. Often colder, especially first thing in the morning. It would plummet to about minus 40. It was amazing. And it would snow every night. We had to sweep up the snow in the freezers every morning. So I was incapable of actually doing a full shift in one of those 2 fork trucks with the low safety cages because my physiology just did not allow that. So this will apply to some jobs where height, strength, manual dexterity, eyesight, even intellectual horsepower will matter in order for someone to do that job or not. For many jobs, it's not a relevance, but for some, it is. So those are the factors that make up the things that relate to an individual, and are they competent? What does the individual bring to the job in front of them? They bring their competence at whatever level it happens to be. And for some jobs, there will be a threshold level those factors will need to be at before they can realistically attempt that job. Okay? So this is the individual part of the equation. So if we go back to this chart, we've then got all the stuff on the right-hand side. And no, I don't have stories about all the stuff on the right-hand side. But let's look at a few of those to explain what they are. So these are the things that surround the worker when they are doing the job in front of them. Here's a thought. Just think back over the last few weeks, the last month. Of all the things that you set out to do on your to-do list, tasks that you attempted, some of them you were able to do, some of them, for some reason, you were unable to do when you wanted to do them. How many times, or what proportion of the time, of the ones that you were unable to do the job, was it because there was something about you that was incompetent against those criteria, something missing that you couldn't bring to the party? And how many times was it your environment that stopped you in your tracks from getting the job done on time or on quality? What sort of proportion do you reckon it's the environment versus the person? Just give me some ideas. What do you think? 75-25 environment being the problem? 50-50? 99% what environment? Yeah? Well, it's like you were saying, you'd rather be incapable than incompetent, which kind of points to the environment as being... So what's really interesting is I've never yet had anybody go below the 50 mark. Yes, you're right. And so he was saying that there's an accumulative effect over time, and the other factor that comes in is someone new into role, actually at that point when they're new, they're in an induction process, they won't know what to do. So it's not clear cut. Again, this is a slippery, messy system we're operating within. But certainly once you've been in a job a little while, actually well over half the time, and many people say 70, 80% of the time when they can't do a job, it's because of things around them that stop them. Whether that's can't get to the files, no spare parts, wrong software, train broke down, laptop broke down, whatever it happens to be. Okay? Now, this is not, by the way, a get out of jail card for you when you can't do a job. And we'll come on to that in a minute. You still have responsibility. I think you mentioned that word earlier, Andy. I think that's really important. So let's look at some of these things on the right-hand side. Management's a big one. When I'm here trying to do a job, how I am managed makes a massive difference to whether I can get that job done or not. Really, really important, that one. We'll come more onto that one later, because after all, management's kind of what we're talking about. What other ones we got there? Culture. How does the culture work around you? Is it a blame culture? Is it a culture that, as you were saying, Andy, go for it? You know, we're better off, within reason, asking for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. Within reason, you've got to risk manage that stuff. I get that. But sometimes people sit back too long. And management is a part of that, because management actually has a huge impact on the culture that surrounds that person when they're doing the job. And a lot of managers manage to manage their teams into mediocrity by stifling people, by not letting them go for it. But it sounds like you guys can go for it, judging by the exercise you did yesterday, and 99 out of whatever it was. Incentives are a factor. Not every company has them. But I notice now from what I heard this morning, you guys are going to a performance-based incentive process. So whoever's setting those incentives up, please make sure that they're focused on getting people doing the right things in the right way. So it's not just doing the right things, it's doing them in the right way. It's back, I think, what you're terming how. So incentives can make a big difference. Did some work with a big semiconductor company once. They wanted me to come in and work. This is, 12, 14 years ago, a long time ago. And it was not long after I'd actually started up on my own in business. And that was in 99. So yes, it must be close to 15 years ago. And they wanted me to work with their sales team. I had been director of Europe for sales for another big IT company, so so I had that background. And they wanted me to work with them to stop them poaching and competing with each other across geographical areas. They didn't want this behavior in the sales team. They wanted them to operate together and more collaboratively. And I went through this with them and I said, yep, we can work on this. Here's some ways to do it. And they said, that sounds a brilliant program. Let's put that together. And then I said, where's your incentive plan? So they showed it to me. And I read it and I said, are you going to change this? And they said, no. So I said, bye. Walked out the door. I knew that there was no way I was ever going to change those behaviors with that incentive plan the way it was. So, as I said, whoever's putting your incentive plan together, make sure it's focusing on the behaviors you want, the hows and stuff like that you want. That will make a massive difference because it's a factor in this environment that surrounds people when they're working. Recognition, again, this is a factor of management, isn't it? How much you get recognized. But it's recognition also from the company at large. I mean, getting presented with a onesie, as some of you are going to be later on, that's recognition. Support, what colleagues are around you. EPS, by the way, is electronic performance support. What have you got available to you in the way of systems, intranet, pop-up help, context help, all those sorts of things? Is that there and available? Systems and processes, these are big ones. How many times have you been at a counter at a bank or talking to a mobile phone company or some other utility and they say, I would love to help you, but I can't? Because they've got some internal system that requires them to get a sign-off or this or that has got to happen before they can actually clear your account or get it running again or do that bit of that transaction for you or whatever it is. We come across it all the time. Now, ultimately, as a customer, we just know for some reason that company in front of us or that person is incapable of doing what we're wanting them to do as a customer. And that's down to the systems and processes they have internally. Tools and software, well, we talked a bit about, just imagine for a moment that mechanic actually did have the spare part, but the special tool required to fit it had been taken home the night before by one of his colleagues and not brought back because his colleague wanted to fix his car. He would be just as incapable without the tool as he would be without the part. Software, have we got the right IT, stuff like that? Spare parts, resources. The list can go on depending on the job. So that's what I mean by environmental stuff. As I'm here doing the job, what's surrounding me? What's there? And of course, if any of those bits are missing out of that entire recipe, then you get a cake that doesn't work out so well. I've been reliably informed that's not a successful baking exercise. Actually, I quite like that gooey bit in the middle, don't you? It was that used to lick it out of the bowl. Cake is better before it's cooked than afterwards sometimes, I reckon. It is the kid, that was my... Okay, so management is a little different, I think, than what we talked about earlier. To me, it's a much more collaborative affair. It makes a lot more sense to work with people. And if you think about it, it's kind of like you were saying earlier, a lot of a manager's job is making sure that environment is fit for purpose in order for people to succeed, which is what you were saying as well earlier, is success for the team is really what the manager is there for. So in a sense, what's going on is management is something you do for people, not something you do to people. Let me say it again. Management is something you do for people, not to people. Just think about how that changes things. Changes everything as a manager. If your focus is on doing things for the people in your team, to help them be successful, to help them be brilliant. And actually you have the power to do that, which is why you've got superpowers. We'll come on to them in a minute. So just take a minute on the table and discuss that little concept of management is something you do for people rather than something you do to people. And come up with an example of a management or a manager in your past, not necessarily here and no names, of something that was done by a manager that is either for or to, and kind of, well, actually, that wasn't very good, I didn't like that, or that was really great. And just notice whether it fits in the for or to category in terms of a management style. So just have a chat about that, and then we'll get some examples of good or bad management.
The performers versus the environment in your area.
Yeah. I think it's very easy to do things for people. For me, I find it very easy to do things for people because we can change so much. So I think for us, and what I'm doing at the moment, I feel like I'm doing things for people to change it and to make it a better environment. As in environment. Well, I came to then feedback I had. People didn't speak to me, so I'm very much about people and real people care. So I go out there to make sure I say good morning to people, I say good night, I sit and do communications with them all the time.
Right.
kind of too magic, because I think I've had some very strong managers that always empower you to be able to go off and do, and talk to people to do other people that tell you what to do. Too managers, so you need to do this and bring it back and show me you've done it. So I think that's their control side of it. And we're getting the two, so I'm not really sure what the two.
I'd always much rather give somebody an opportunity to be creative environment and stuff like that. I think about it, you're taking much more of that kind of coaching and why don't we ever come? But then if you've got a kind of a movable date at the end, sometimes you do get to the right, okay, let's do this sometimes, otherwise everything falls over. So that's, I know for me it always feels like a last resort rather than
And I suppose our gaming session targets, for example, we have to achieve X, Y, Z, so we don't have to do that. That isn't something, you can do, like, you have to achieve those. You have to go out and find a way of doing it. By doing it, it's making sure we have all the right resources in place, making sure, if people are sick, how we can overcome it. So, that is to do it, we have to do it, and we can't not do it. But I think the four is empowering people, isn't it, so that they can go out.
Glad we just have a tissue for you.
We're all one.
Is that now lockdown? Now you can,
Yeah, I was just reflecting, I was thinking how you and I interact that day. I think by and large, you helped me to set the framework and how to do it rather than scripted. So I think our relationship is four place. I mean, there are things like your targets on the four place. There are things about each head, like very improvements. By and large, one way that happens is that you're on the stage and you get on with it. So I would say we're probably
I think it's important to get really clear on the desired outcome.
Yes.
Instead of whether it's a gambling commission target or whether it's a piece of work, or the more you spend time setting the context, I think that's really important. But I do agree with what you're saying. That every now and again, hopefully not too often, every now and again, you do need to be scripted. You just need to ask, there's a sort of, this has to be done by then, and there's but the more that should be by exception. The more that you teach them just getting on with stuff that needs to be done, and they follow the context of it. Well, yeah, I mean, your point is interesting. I do think we have stuff in the organisation, that gets in people's way. That's sort of either real or imagined, imaginary regulatory constraints, or assumptions that somehow can be allowed, or assumptions that someone else has to, there's a lot of stuff that's probably not even that real, actually. Some of it's real, but a lot of it is almost, we've always done that way.
A lot of it's perception.
And I think we have quite a lot of clutter, which is perception clutter rather than real.
I mean, that's why they can tie an elephant up with a chain that it can break. It's because the elephant's had the chain since they were a baby. It's perception.
What about you,
Emma? I think it's just all about communication. I think, it is about empowering people and giving them the context. Kind of yesterday illustrated that. But there will be times when people need direction, and rather than a perceived direction, if you're communicating right, then you'll understand exactly what they need and when they need it. So I think as long as you've got a good relationship and a trust-based relationship and you can communicate well,
One observation here, the microphone was taken from here. People hear it over the speakers. It's far. I can just hear you coming through the roof.
brilliant.
They were saying dodgy, but just I'm picking it up from somewhere.
Oh, it's here, I think. Maybe this wasn't turned off. Okay. How are we doing? Any examples of what as I said, no names of an instance that you would consider really good management? Something you experienced? Some of you must have had that, surely.
I had a manager who recognised how I like to work individually,
Right.
a style, and let me get on with it. And there was a trust thing. I was allowed to get on with my job in the way I wanted to. And that meant a lot to me because there was trust and empowerment.
So for those of you maybe didn't hear, it's a manager who recognised her style and then gave you the space to use that style, and there was a trust level there. So would you define that as 4 or 2 type management? Yeah. He was giving you that space. So it was about you rather than about him, her. What other ones have we got? Good or bad examples? Go for it. Oh, we have a microphone.
Yeah. Very supportive through that process. And it finally kicked in, but hopefully I've got quite a loud voice anyway, so you probably heard all that.
Yeah, so again, that was an example of a manager doing for you rather than to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other examples? Or any other comments on that split of 4 or 2? Yeah, go for it. Hang on, there's a microphone coming just there.
I had a manager who used to ask me to do pieces of work, and I described it as go and design a cover of a notepad, and I would come back and say, it looks like this. And he would reach for his drawer and he'd say, yes, and I did it already. And mine looked like this. And I prefer mine. And actually I totally disengaged because every piece of work I just thought, well, why bother? Because he's already done it and he prefers his own.
Yeah.
And I left the company. It was that awful. I left the company. Yeah. And that was being done too.
Absolutely.
You should have stayed. No work, nothing.
Any other ones? Yep.
It was kind of reiterating, I think, what the last 2 people have said, actually, which is managers recognising when you don't know how to do something and helping you do it. So if you're being set a task, then this is how you go about doing it to some degree, versus just saying, this is your task, go away and succeed, versus saying, these are the things that you might need to think about, this is what we already don't know, just a little bit of support to say, this is the structure of the task that we're asking you to complete, or whatever it is, to help you set up for success.
So it's back to that concept of service.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a full-fledged service you're giving to someone. By the way, the arbiter of the quality of any service is the recipient of that service. That's interesting. When you're serving people as a manager, they're the people who decide whether you're a good manager or not you.
Yeah, I was just reminded of yesterday we had the Chief Executive UK Sport came in, and she was explaining that on some of the sports that had hitherto not been doing well, they were kind of described as failing, and they'd made a very important transition where they would come along and they'd kind of have a red flag, and much more positioning as we need help. And UK Sport were very much and the enablers of helping those sports to get better, and they kind of changed the psychology of what is it we can do for you to help you actually improve your capability in your sport, because ultimately they knew UK Sport wanted them to succeed and get that sort of medal potential. So the psychology of you're failing, you're useless, as opposed to no, we're here, we can help you, and encouraging, I guess it's an interesting question for us at Camelot. Do we encourage people to kind of come forward and ask for help enough, and do we have a culture where it's kind of okay to ask for help, or do we have people who are a bit kind of reluctant to ask for help because somehow that's seen as a sign of weakness? It's quite an interesting question, but obviously in that sport world, it was one of the key parts of getting some of the less successful sports to start coming through.
Yeah. I mean, that comes back to the comment I made earlier about performance management, as it's often put forward in the management training courses, is a place where you're considered failing, so therefore we've got to kind of get the big stick out or deal with it. So yeah, is that another...
We talked We talked about cross-functional leadership. So sometimes you have to lead teams that are in different teams.
Yes.
So that's quite different, and actually often it's quite hard.
Yep.
It's actually obviously other teams have their own agendas, have their own things that they need to be working through. So it's not just about leading your own team; it's also about leading cross-functional teams.
Yep. So leading across functions, and it can be hard. Absolutely, it can be hard. No one ever said being a superhero was easy. Look at what they get up to on the movies. They get hammered, don't they? But they always win. They always win. A couple of other things that came out of that is sometimes managing for people, by the way, is not just throwing the stuff over the fence and letting them get on with it. There's the support that's required right through that whole process. And that brings to mind the idea of setting an insurance policy on things that you delegate. By that I mean, if you delegate a task to someone, you need to have some understanding of where they're at in terms of their competence in order to do the task. Do they need a lot of help to do that? In which case I want a high level of insurance. Here's the task, go away, think about it, come back with some ideas, then tell me what you intend to do. That's a high level of insurance. The low level of insurance is go away, do it, and tell me when you're finished. See the difference? So there's a situational thing here in terms of understanding your people well enough to know how to delegate to them and how much empowerment to give them, given that you need to risk manage the process of that delegation. Does that make sense? So there's more factors coming in here. And also you need to be thinking about if someone does need some upskilling, some more knowledge, if they need a lift in their competence in order to be able to do this task, then that becomes part of what you need to deliver to them in order for them to be delegated that task. So this is part of the service. Now, often you can do that just by taking them through it or telling them about it. But there is this idea that a manager needs to be developing their people. This really hit me in the face the other day because I was reading an article from Harvard Business Review. Just, you know, a little publication that actually has a fair bit of clout in the world. And there was the headline of this article, which actually said, if you are managing and not developing your people, you are not management material. Full stop. If you are managing and not developing your people, you are not management material. Whoa. That's pretty heavy coming from a publication like Harvard Business Review. The other thing that you serve people with is to help them get their strokes. Helping recognition. You know, that sort of thing. Helping them understand when they've done well. And that's about catching people doing something right, rather than catching people doing something wrong. Have you ever come across that term, seagull management? You know, managers that fly in, crap on people, fly out again. That's doing 2, by the way. That's not doing 4. So catch people doing something right, and then you'll help perpetuate that way of doing things. I'm not saying that the people that are working for you need training in this way, but in order to get the whale in the aquarium, you know, the show for the aquarium to jump over the high wire out of the water, they don't put the wire up above the water and then start saying to the whale, go on, jump then. They put the rope on the bottom of the pool first, and as the whale swims across it, or the dolphin, they give it a fish. And then they slowly lift the rope up. And the dolphin gets the idea that jumping over that rope gets a fish. The other thing they do, by the way, is occasionally give them a fish for no reason whatsoever. That's interesting. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. Now, why all the superhero stuff? Because there's lots of them. There's more of you in the room than there are in that picture there. The reason that you have superpowers, and by the way, when you become a manager, you get these superpowers automatically. It comes with the territory. You cannot avoid them. Sorry about that, but you're all superheroes already. Most of you haven't realized it yet, but you will shortly. When you get to be a manager, you get this bag. It's got superpowers as well. That's why it's invisible. And it sits next to your desk with a super onesie in it. but most people don't know it's there. The superpower you have when you become a manager is the power to affect the environment that surrounds the people on your team when they are doing the jobs you're delegating to them for them to do. Most of those things on the right-hand side of that thing about the environment, you as a manager have a huge amount of control over. Some you may not, like incentives, but most of them actually are within your control, particularly the bit where management is the piece that surrounds them. So you cannot point to that environment and say, oh, the reason the team's not doing well is because there's something wrong. You're responsible for that environment. The problem is it's so easy as a manager to say, oh, we'll blame the people. We'll say there's something wrong with them, and we'll focus on the people when we don't get great performance. You need to focus on the people and the environment. It's a big system running. The reason a manager loves to focus on the people is it lets them off the hook, because you can blame somebody else. Whereas managers actually, underneath the skin, unconsciously, you know that you're responsible for that environment. And if that's not quite right, that's why people love to blame their team members rather than... Do you get what I mean? So I'm sorry, you can't get off the hook here. But the good news is you've got these superpowers. I read an interesting thing the other day, and it said, a person's manager is the single most important person to them in the organization. A person's manager is the single most important person to them in the organization. They look up to you. In many ways, you are the superhero. You're the person with all this power, all this control over how they operate, what's around them when they're doing stuff at work. And it's not just how you can affect that at work, because if things aren't going at work, do people take it home? You bet they do. So what you're doing, whether it's frustrating them or pleasing them, whether you're doing it for them or to them, will affect their family life, will affect their kids, will affect it. The ripples are huge. So reach down beside your desk, grab that invisible bag, because you can see it now, take out the onesie, put it on, polish the underpants, and wear them with pride. Do you see what I mean about these superpowers? There's a huge amount you can do to affect this stuff. There's that chart again. Most of that stuff on the right-hand side, and quite a bit of stuff on the left, is within your powers to deal with as a manager. But too often in the past, performance has been focused on the left-hand side. And yes, sometimes when you're not getting the performance you want, whether it's substandard or whether it's okay, but you want to uplift it because you're looking for more with less, doesn't matter where you are on that spectrum. If you want better performance, sometimes, yes, it is the left-hand side. Now, here's a little seductive thing that blindsides many people, is if there's a job here, John cannot do it, but Sally can. It's very easy to assume there's something wrong with John. It's very seductive to think, actually, if someone can do it, then it's got to be doable, so therefore whoever can't do it must be deficient in something. Yeah? Automatically, okay, what we need to do is send John away to get trained or do something to get them up to, send them off to L&D for the magic pixie dust that L&D has. It's very easy to think there's something wrong there. But you see, what can be going on in the background, because this performance is a system, and there's lots of different levers you can pull, what might be happening is there's lots of things in the environment around that task which are actually stopping people from doing the task. So John might be at a threshold level of competency, but he's just threshold. And actually, with that environment against him, he's not going to manage to do it. Sally's been in the business years, knows that environment inside out, and has found ways to buck the system and get around the corners. So she manages to get the job done, because she knows stuff that John doesn't. So yes, you've got an option to get John and all his colleagues at the same level and train them up and get them as good. In other words, give them 15 years of experience. That's a pretty expensive ask. Another way to do it is to fix the environment that surrounds John so John can do it now and all his colleagues can do it. You'll often find that fixing the environment, and we talked earlier, it's anywhere between 60, 70, 80% of the times when someone can't do a thing in front of them. Fixing the environment, you will find, is cheaper, quicker than trying to fix the people. And actually, often the people don't need fixing anyway. So what I'm going to do is show you a brief tool that you can use to drill into this to find out where the levers are in this system you can pull to start affecting performance. And there's often more than one lever you can pull. So then it's about, well, which is the better lever? Which has the least total cost of ownership if we pull that lever? Does that make sense? Okay, what do we got next? So that is your role, effectively, as a manager. You're a capability manager. You're managing capability. Because if you manage capability, in other words, you manage all the components that lead into capability, you will get the performance you want. And you can notice this is about doing for people, helping them, serving them to get across the gap they need to get across to get the job done. So, if there's something wrong with the recipe, in other words, if you're not getting the performance you want, then the question becomes, why? What are the barriers? What's getting in the way? And actually, you'll find, if you were trying to push a car and there was a brick in front of the wheel, would you keep trying to push the car over the brick, or would you go around the front and take the brick away first? Much, much easier to remove the brick, isn't it? Much easier. And yet in many companies, because it's the way we've always done things around here, come on, let's all push, and they all keep pushing the car. We were just talking about this earlier. There's often this perception of how things are done. This is the culture that gets built up over time. So be aware of that. There are no chains so great as what you impose upon yourselves through the culture you've built for yourselves. You've probably seen elephants tied up at a circus or somewhere like that, or there's a little chain around there, and you look at it and say, there's a peg in the ground. I could pull that peg out. There's an elephant on the end of it. Elephants don't go anywhere. The reason is they've been chained up with a similar sized peg since they were that big and couldn't pull it out of the ground. They've learned that it's not possible to do that. People are the same. We build these cages around ourselves, culturally in organizations, to stop us from doing things. Another interesting experiment they did, there's fascinating ones like this, it's right across the animal kingdom. They put a pig in an area with an electric fence that was just at the right height to zap its ears, and then they took the fence away after a week. The pig wouldn't go outside the boundary, even though there was no fence left. They had another experiment. They did this big fish tank, and they had a pike in one end of it. Pikes are really, that's a predator fish, big teeth. And they had these guppies on the other side of this tank and a bit of glass in the middle. And this pike would bang its head against the glass in the middle, trying to get through to the other end of the tank to feed on guppies, because guppy stew is what pikes like. After a while it stopped, because it realized there was no way that it could get through. They pulled the glass out of the middle of the tank, and now the pike and the guppies were swimming together, and the guppies were perfectly safe, because the pike realized that guppies are no longer pike food in terms of this particular pike's life. So we are all susceptible to this. Okay, what's wrong with the recipe? Has anybody come across the fishbone diagram, the Ishikawa cause-effect diagram? Some of you will have. It's taught on most management courses. It's a very venerable business tool, been around since the 1920s actually. But a chap called Ishikawa Kaoru in the 1960s popularized it in the Kawasaki shipyards as a quality tool. But it's designed to look at an effect and then decide what the contributing causes are to that effect. You can use this to drill into that capability map that we had. So I'm just going to explain this slightly, and then we've got a handout well, you might as well start handing it out now. That's got that chart. It's got this piece on it. If you don't know the tool, it's very simple. On the right-hand side, you put an effect you want to investigate, and then you put a line back from there, and then other lines out from it, which have some potential causes for that effect. And you end up with a diagram that looks a bit like a fishbone, hence the term fishbone diagram. So I've taken the liberty of drawing a fish around the outside. I'm not an artist, as you can see. So what you do with this is you can see on this particular fish, there's the 4 pieces that relate to an individual's competence. And then you can do a second diagram which relate to the things that are in the environment that surround a person when they're doing. So on that handout, there's a little exercise for you to do now to just start and have a look at something you've got going on at the moment, a performance uplift you'd like to see, and just start thinking about all the different factors that would contribute to the lower performance than you'd like. And just come up with some ideas about what you can actually do with it tomorrow or next week. So we'll take a few minutes of that, and then we'll come back together, and I've got some wrap-up stuff to do. Okay, and I'll mention that because I know it's valid. Yeah.
Because I know that I've got a manager that's actually it enables me to do much what I want to do. But my barrier is that I just don't show it. So people don't know what I'm doing, and therefore I don't have the support I need because they don't really get where I need the support.
And the other thing they won't realise as much is your brand within the organisation, your personal brand, won't be shining bright because they just don't know who you are. You're a bit of a blank, fuzzy spot for them. So, yeah. Yeah. Probably, I got underway a little later, so we can probably duck the Q&A or something. We'll see.
We're going to get some sharing from the tables
Now, yeah, a little bit, yeah. So what I wanted to do is just get a couple of ideas on one or two things that you are going to be able to do that will make a difference in the next few days, week, with you and your teams. And please share, because someone else will say, oh, I could do that too. What have you got? Just a couple of examples.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So in some of the members of my team, there's a bit of a lack of confidence in decision making.
Yep.
So they're capable, really, really capable, but they always come to me to ask the question on, you know, should this be the thing that I'm doing? Can I do this? Giving them the power to actually make those decisions and then run with them themselves instead of always checking in with me is a really important part of that. So yeah, I think the key thing on looking at the diagram is around mindset.
Yeah.
So the skills are there, the capability is there, the knowledge is there. It's about having the mindset to you know, just take those things and run with them. And I think I've got to empower my people more to do that, but also celebrate the successes. So when they do something that they've made the decision on, we're celebrating that success, and that gives them the confidence to continue to do it.
What you've sort of come up with there is a really important piece. Is this, that chart you've got there is just a model. By the way, it's not true. By definition, when you create a model, you look at reality and you take bits out of it until you've got something that we can get our little tiny human brains around. So almost by definition, the fact that we even just put it into language means it's no longer true. The question is it useful? And that model is actually very useful. Some models are much more useful than others. But what's important is to understand that what's going on in that chart is a system. All these things are interrelated. So you talked about them not being capable, but also you were talking about them also potentially not being competent. So if there's a mindset thing, you might say, well, that's something they're bringing to it, but why are they bringing that mindset? Well, it's because of the way they've been managed in the past potentially has created that mindset. So you see how this is all interrelated. So it's a system running. You've got to start thinking systems. And that's what this is useful for, this model, is to start saying, where are the levers I can pull that are going to make a difference to this system? And what, you know, and there's a lot of levers you can pull which cost absolutely nothing and can be done very quickly. What you've just described is one of them, absolutely. Any other ones? Another one? Somebody's got to have something. You were all chatting away madly there, weren't you?
So the team that I work in is responsible for managing part of security risk, and often, and back to the mindset point, the team feels there's creating a difference between being passionate about the work they do and sometimes getting tied up in the emotion of the decisions. And so there's some work to do. I've got to do to try and extract the emotion, get mindset into extracting emotion if decisions don't necessarily go the team's way, or still being passionate about the work, but not being emotional about getting the emotion.
Yeah. So what can you do about that as a manager?
It'll be about putting things in the wider context and bringing the context to the situation.
Yeah.
I think it's really important.
And it's really important that people know what sort of good looks like, what that bigger context is like. And Andy was laying out some of that earlier when he started speaking. People have got to know what good looks like. Very often managers don't actually help people understand what good looks like. You do something, like do a notebook cover, and because they haven't really defined what good looks like, the job gets done and you think, well, kind of what I think it should be, but I'm really not sure until I take it. So that's part of the delegation process. And of course, that's part of the management environment that you put around people, is helping them understand what good looks like. And sometimes what good looks like is just get on and do it right now, because we've got to do it because we've got 5,000 desktops down because the file server's dead. There isn't time for a lot of chit-chat. You've just got to get on with it. So this isn't always about consensual democratic management. You've got to look at the situation too. But it's about what you need to do to help them be successful. How do you serve them? And sometimes you serve them best by telling them what to do right now. But that's a judgment call. We talked about that earlier in this table here, yeah. Just one more. Anyway, got to be one more. Yep, go for it.
This is a very recent example of where my manager took action as out of something. We had a huge performance issue of a family of mice running around Brettenham House, which plummeted productivity to somewhere below zero and increased the shrieking quite significantly. And there was a huge amount of, well, this is so-and-so's fault, or it's the building's fault, or it's someone else's fault, or what should we be done? And there was some diving around with a bin to try and catch them. And my manager took action and actually brought sort of nuclear warfare to the mice family, who have sadly left us now, but it does mean we can all get some work done.
Yeah. So, yeah. So an infestation of mice is part of the environment you have to deal with, absolutely. See, management's is never-ending set of challenges. You know. Part of it's rodent control, yeah. Not the rodent on your computer, but the real ones running around the floor, you know. So, yeah. Okay, so in effect, what we're looking at is a way to diagnose performance, which is going to get you down to some root causes or barriers, the brick in front of the wheel of the car we're talking about pushing. And that will get you some solutions that will actually work. Because how many times in the past do we have a performance problem and we sort of prod at it a bit, but because we haven't teased it apart, we're just kind of prodding in a somewhat hopeful manner. And usually what we do is we send the people who are not performing off. Because see, the problem is if you get a performer on a stage, it's very easy to blame the performer when the performance isn't there. But if you put Dame Judi Dench on the stage but didn't give her any lights or any sound system, it would be very doubtful if she could use it to do a performance that was actually going to be of any good. But we know she's a brilliant actress. Okay? So the stage that people are performing on is a vital part of the performance. And that's one of the things you've really got to remember. Not the whole story, but a vital part of it. It's too often forgotten. So this is the final slide. It's got a wake-up call. There's something really wrong with this slide. Well, there's several things wrong with this slide, actually. What do you think? What's wrong with the slide? They don't live in the same place. Yes, those penguins have commuted a long, long way to annoy a polar bear. And the penguin's got a handbag, yeah. I tried to blow it up to see whether it was Prada or not, but I couldn't get there. Well, get his beak in the way, yeah. Actually, I ran a competition once, so we won't do that here, but on what's in the handbag. What do you think's in the handbag? Fish? Really? That's what, packed lunch, I suppose, yeah. What else could be in the handbag? iPhone, yeah. That's a good one, I like that one. Because her husband's going to need it when he wakes that polar bear up, absolutely.
If it's a female penguin, it could be absolutely anything in that.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a fifth dimension in there where it just kind of bottoms out with all this stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So that's us. We've got a time for a break. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to be hanging around for a bit, so if you've got any questions, come say hi. But I do want to get you away now because we had a finished time. I hope that was useful. So remember, it's not just the performer, it's the performer and the stage. Okay, see you at the break. Thank you.
I'm now the only thing that stands between you and a break, so I will be quick. So I think just a quick recap on this morning to say, so Andy talked about the importance of responsibility, and I suppose one of the things that we didn't necessarily spend a huge amount of time talking about yesterday in the values piece, but a reminder that it's really, really important. And Paul's just going to recap, but I suppose we were talking about how important it is to create an environment for success, and just a bit of a nudge around something that we raised yesterday is that obviously we're spending a lot of time discussing this content here, but thinking about how you're going to take that back to the business and create an environment with your teams as to how you share some of these messages to help them be successful. And my sad confession is I watch a lot of pretty shit cooking programs, I would be say, and I don't know how you're always going to get to that situation where they go in and look at what's going on with the restaurant. It's never that the chef can't cook the food. It's always between the relationship, quite often between the front of house and the back of house. So they're just kind of piling all the orders in. They're not really thinking about whether or not the people are capable of cooking it, or they've put too many dishes on the menu. And I suppose we've talked a lot about how we work together, but just thinking about across teams, how we either contribute to the environment that helps another team be successful, or sometimes when we contribute to making that team almost putting more constraints on them, that means they're never going to be capable of delivering the task that we need them to deliver for us. So I suppose one to think about in terms of how we work with each other.